for me, it's really important that people understand the things we label sin are adaptive strategies to survive. There are these strategies that our protectors adopt, and I've come to realize that that ability to adapt is just as much a God-given resource as the qualities of self-energy that we describe.
Hey everyone, I'm Tammy Sollenberger, the author of The One Inside, 30 Days to Your Authentic Self. This podcast is for anyone curious about who they are, the different parts of themselves, and for those who want to connect with their true self. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here. I am super excited to welcome back to the podcast Molly LaCroix. Molly is a IFS Level 3 certified consultant, and she is a 2-time author. And she was on the podcast. We were just talking, we think it was in the spring of 2021, talking about her first book. And so she is back on the podcast talking about her second book, Journey to Shalom, Finding Healing, Wholeness, and Freedom in Sacred Stories. So Molly, before we get into, I'm super excited to talk about this. So, but before we get into that, tell everybody where you are in the world and what you see when you look out your nearest window.
I am in Bend, Oregon, which is central Oregon, just east of the Cascades. So it's not the rainy part of Oregon. It's high desert, like 4,000 feet altitude. And I get to look at pine trees and deer walk by my office window. It's fantastic. I love it here.
Tell me about this book and what you did before we kind of unpack it a little bit. So tell me about what inspired you to write this book and what inspired you to write it in the way that you wrote it.
Yes. So a little bit of background for listeners who don't know me. I got my master's in marriage and family therapy at a seminary. And so I've always integrated Christian spirituality and got all excited about IFS because it integrates really well with Christian spirituality and many other forms of spirituality, of course. And on the heels of the first book, I was listening to a podcast. I'm really a theology nerd. I love this guy named Pete Enns, who, biblical scholar. And he was talking about how the Old Testament, really should be called the Hebrew Bible, was compiled after the Babylonian exile. And so when people who've experienced exile are compiling these stories, and so exile's all over the place, the impact of exile. And I'm sitting here thinking, and I got this inspiration for wouldn't it be cool to dive into these ancient stories through the lens of IFS? And it was a while before I actually started writing the book. But once I did, it just was this fascinating interplay of the stories we hold, that all the parts of us hold, and these ancient stories that can be a doorway into our own stories.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Yeah, I mean, we think about like in the Old Testament / Hebrew Bible, right? Like the Israelites were exiled. I mean, that's what they were. That's what we call it.
Yeah, it's that ancient story of Adam and Eve in the garden. They're exiled from the garden, and then you have the Exodus, and then you have, the northern kingdom was exiled to Assyria. The southern kingdom was exiled to Babylon. I mean, it's all over the place.
Wow, that there is this external exile. I want to say like exileism. That's not even a word, but like that has to happen.
Right. These forces that, as we know, when you think of systems, there's an internal system, but we're embedded in a concentric series of circles of systems. Yeah. And so there are these forces that operate on groups, as we know, so many different people groups have been exiled. And yeah, it just caught my attention, and
I love that. I also love that process. It kind of was an idea that like percolated for a little while, which I think is what happens when you write a book. It's sort of like, here's this idea, and then it kind of hangs out for a little while.
Mm-hmm.
You actually like write it. For sure. So tell me in chapter 1, you use Hagar's story to introduce self. So tell us, for people that don't know, give us a little bit about who Hagar was and sort of tell us her story, and then tell us how you use that to introduce self.
Yeah. So Hagar was an enslaved woman living with Abraham and Sarah, presumably, probably sold by her family into slavery. And so utterly powerless. And most people are familiar with the story of Abraham and Sarah. Sarah couldn't get pregnant. Sarah comes up with this solution: go lie with this servant. And so the first vignette that I looked at was Hagar left when she got pregnant. There was this kind of hostile interaction with Sarah, and Hagar fled into the desert. And here's this woman, utterly powerless, overwhelmed, pregnant, flees into the desert, and she encounters God. And there's a womanist theologian named Will Gaffney, and she noted that Hagar is the first person to name God in the scriptures. And she named God El Roi, the God who listens, the God who hears me. And I thought, what an incredible example of what we talk about in IFS of self-energy and of the greater self, and how she, in her extreme situation, was met by God. And God, there are people who've written about how awful it is that she went back to Abraham and Sarah, and we could unpack that. But she did go back, and Ishmael was born. God also promised her that her son, would be the father of a great nation of Islam, and the people of Islam, have whatever the right term would be. And then Hagar, years pass, and there's another encounter with Sarah, who is now, we've got Isaac on the scene, and there's conflict because Sarah's worried about Isaac being the primary son, and then Hagar is sent away. First time she fled, second time she's sent away. And once again, and it's this incredible scene that gives me goosebumps every time I think of it. She's in the desert, she's got her child, and they're going to die. Desert's not a hospitable place. When parts of us are in exile, they're not in hospitable places. And she leaves her son and walks away far enough. They said, I can't remember now. I should know this. A stone's throw or an arrow distance away, far enough that she doesn't have to watch her child die. And God meets her there too, and shows her water, and she's able to get her son and survive. So it's just a beautiful way to introduce, mostly in that chapter, I'm focusing on self, because my intention with this book was to peel the onion of the model and really just start with self. Then what's this thing called multiplicity, going through, the different parts of ourselves and so on.
I love that. And so you start with self, which I love starting with self. I feel like we usually start with parts. So you start with self, and you start with self and self showing up and listening and seeing and witnessing and being with, just like God was with Hagar.
Yeah. Yeah. And making that connection between the self in us and the greater self, the divine, God,
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. And then what about, well, let me ask you this. Why do you think it was important to start with self?
It is a point of integration with various spiritualities, including Christian spiritualities, understanding. I think it's so powerful for our healing journey to understand we have this undamaged core inside ourselves. And part of the challenge in the Christian community is that there are places in the Christian community that don't teach that. They teach the opposite, that you're utterly depraved. And part of my mission is to say, no, that's not true. We are created in the image of God. And so, of course, we have these God-given resources that are undamaged in us. And so that's just an important perspective as we are encountering something that for some people reading the book would be brand new. This idea of understanding ourselves, and then then when we get into parts, it just feels more grounded and more in the foundational truth of who we are.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. I love that too, because I think, and I think every time I have someone with Christian faith on the podcast, we always have to talk about this because I think it's so important that I think anybody raised in Christianity, there is this belief. Sort of the first thing is you have to believe that you're a sinner because you're a sinner that needs to be saved. And so I think that is sort of our first cell. The first cell of IFS is like, is that actually there is this God image in us. There is this self. And that's and I think that makes sense then, because it's almost like that's the first cell, is that like actually there is this beauty and divinity inside of you.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And we can talk now or later about this whole notion of what is it to sin and what does it mean? And
let's do it. Let's do it now. And then
go right there.
Yeah, we'll go right there.
And this is so of course I unpack different parts of the system. We talk about protectors. There's a chapter about managers and a chapter about firefighters. And I introduce multiplicity with the story of King David. He's held up as this man after God's own heart and the king, and he's so great. Yeah, and he raped Bathsheba and made sure her husband was murdered. So what's going on here? And multiplicity is the best lens through which to understand that. And so, of course, David sinned. But was that his whole identity? No, it wasn't. There was more to him. And so for me, it's really important that people understand that the things we label sin are adaptive strategies to survive. They're these strategies that our protectors adopt. And I've come to realize that ability to adapt is just as much a God-given resource as the qualities of self-energy that we describe. What if we didn't have the ability to adapt to our circumstances? We'd all be dead. I mean, evolution's about adaptation, and so we have this innate ability to adapt, and that's what these protective strategies are. And as you and I both know, that doesn't mean we say, oh yeah, sure, no problem, keep doing what you're doing, no matter what chaos and dysfunction it's causing. But if we start with this perspective that this is a heroic part of the system who had no choice but to do this thing, we're starting where Jesus starts. We're starting with grace. We're starting with unconditional love. We're starting by meeting somebody where they are.
I love that. And Molly, you did such a beautiful job with that. Thank you. That's such a gift to sort of to use David as an example of teaching multiplicity, and also to talk about Jesus in this unconditional love way. Because I think about how many people are listening to this episode and have religious trauma or horrible experiences with what they think is Jesus, and it's not right. It's not with the Jesus that or so I just think you just said so much. I'm like, almost want to like pause, rewind, re-listen to what you just said again, and just have people really notice what their parts are doing right now.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm so passionate about this stuff that I'm in a doctoral program doing a project about spiritual abuse. I mean, I want to keep bringing resources to the Christian community to both name what has been done in the name of God that has harmed people so badly, which is just heartbreaking, and also to help them, to offer something to help them heal from those experiences.
Molly, that's beautiful. So we have two places we can go here. One is I'm really curious about what you use to teach managers and firefighters.
Okay.
And then we can also go, I mean, I think we have time. I think if you're okay, we could do that. And then I also, why don't we do that? Why don't we start with sort of how maybe managers first, if you want, and sort of what you use to teach managers.
Yeah, so the story, I envisioned a fictional character named Reuben, who was the head of household during the Exodus. So, God's people, they're rescued from Egypt and now they're wandering in the desert. And most people are, familiar with the story of the golden calf. And it's easy to say, good grief, people. God's providing water and food and appearing in the fire and the clouds and speaking to Moses. What's wrong with you? Why don't you trust God? But I just imagine Reuben as the head of a household with a wife and children, and they're in the desert and they keep encountering these times when it's uncertain. There isn't any water. There isn't food. What's going on? Moses disappears and he's gone for a long time. And what that does inside of us, especially, that fear and his desire to care for his family and the fear that it provokes when he feels unable to do so, and how that can cause someone to lean into control. Our managers want to control things. And so this group gets together, and I imagine Reuben as somebody who's kind of a leader in this, going to Aaron and saying, we need a new strategy. Forget about Moses. He left us. He's nowhere to be found. We need this golden calf, and we are going to reorient. We're going to worship the golden calf instead.
Yeah.
And instead of mocking that, recognizing we all have parts of us who jump in to take control in the face of uncertainty, and that those were such real fears. And then in that chapter, I go through lots of different kinds of typical managers that many people have in their system and explain more about them.
Molly, I keep saying this. Molly, that's beautiful. Molly, that's beautiful. I'm just going to keep saying that. I love that so much because I think about that story and I think about the, manna every day. And I think about my system that's like, yeah, I'll get manna today, but I probably won't get it tomorrow. So I will make sure that I go ahead and gather the food, even though it's going to spoil, right? They gather the food to try to control, but then the food spoils. But I think about how I do that even now. Okay, last month we were good, everything's good, but next month, I don't know. There's or this worked out this time, but it's probably not going to work out next time. Sure. I just really just identifying, kind of noticing how often I do that. It's almost like parts that protect from the vulnerability, like the vulnerability of either parts of me that think I'm not going to have enough, which I don't know that I've ever not had enough. It's sort of part of me, sort of the scarcity part.
Sure.
That feels really vulnerable, like to trust God or the universe or whatever, like to trust that I'm going to be taken care of, or that I'm going to be loved, or I'm going to be known or listened to. Actually, no, I'm not going to trust that. I'm going to try to figure that out myself. I'm like, yeah, that's right. That sounds about right.
Yeah, absolutely. And our culture is hyper productive, and that's part of it. It's the never enough, the scarcity. And so these managers, they take in these messages and do their thing. And and as we know, what's most helpful is a marriage of, I always think of self-linking arms with these wonderful parts of the system. And let's do this together. So yes, we do those things that we need to do to be responsible, but we have the energy of self to say, oh, maybe that's enough. Maybe we can rest. Maybe we can even play to keep things in harmony.
Yeah, I love the linking arms. And then we still need to, we still need to travel, or we still need to build the shelters that they were building because they were journeying. That's just, things still need to happen.
Yeah.
And there is trust. So it's both. I think sometimes my system is sort of have some all or nothing parts. And so I love that it's both. It's they're traveling and they're trusting.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. I love that. And then what about firefighters?
Firefighters. So this is tender territory, but I took a look at those religious leaders who wanted to kill Jesus. And I want to be really clear with the listeners. This is not about anti-Semitism, that this is about some of the religious leaders who really believed they were doing the right thing. So it helps to understand the history, that it was an honor and shame culture. And the understanding of honor was to follow God's law. And here comes this guy, Jesus, who's doing all this stuff on the Sabbath that you're not supposed to do, and claiming things you're not supposed to claim, and all of the things. And so they reacted because they were afraid that if they didn't protect their people by following God's law, that the Romans would take over even more than they already had. I mean, they were under the boot of the Roman Empire as it was. And so they're up against those stresses anyway. And then here comes somebody else who's rocking the boat of their understanding of how to be faithful. And it just shows the most extreme thing that firefighters can do, is something like having homicidal intent. And the extremes that they do is because of the pain that they are trying to avoid. And so that's a rather provocative way to introduce firefighters, but it also, I think, helps people understand that this is something we all have in us. We all have this capability to take these extreme measures if that's what part of our system thinks we need to survive.
Yeah, that's so good, because firefighters are provocative, right? They are, right? They are. And that is such a good story because there was that fear, right? There was such fear there, and really thinking they're doing the right thing. Like there was clear rules of right and wrong, and what in our own systems, when we think about what's right and wrong, and we all have our own ideas of what that means. And so, that's really great. And I'm assuming you also do that list of like typical firefighters that get us in trouble, and we have parts that don't like them.
Yeah. I go through, lots of examples of different kinds of firefighters and what provokes them, and what they're, and again, always with this positive intention, no matter what.
Yeah. And I love that you use this really kind of emotional story, because we can say it intellectually, like, yes, they have a positive intention, but to think about these guards, and that, they have positive intention. It's like, it's hard to believe that. And it's hard to believe when we have parts that are ruining our lives, when we have parts that are ruining our lives, to be like, they have a positive intention. So I think it's really good to use that story because it has such a power, like a punch, it has a punch to it. And so one more, and then, tell me about the Good Samaritan. Remind people what the story is, and then let's talk about how that's a good example of how our internal work impacts our relationship with other people.
Yeah. Once I get through all the different layers of the model, I pivot to, which I think is such an important pivot always, that, and particularly maybe in the Christian community where there's still, believe it or not, some pushback about, no, you're just supposed to focus on others and God, never yourself. And say, well, the great commandment is to love God, others as we love ourselves. So I think learning to love ourselves is kind of important, but it's never an end unto itself. It's about, now I'm more able to show up in loving ways in my relationships. And so the Good Samaritan, the story is that, first a priest walks by this person who's apparently been assaulted and keeps going. And I imagine what's going on inside of this particular person. And I imagined him as someone who was just in a hurry to get home after a long day and couldn't be bothered. And the road to it was noted for being treacherous. That bandits were on this road. So even though it's a parable, it's set in a contemporary place that people would have known, oh, yeah, that's a dangerous place to be walking alone. The second person is more afraid. And I don't know what's going on here. Maybe this is a trap, and also walks by. Sadly, I found research from Princeton Seminary back in the 70s of a study that they did where they took seminary students told them the story of the Good Samaritan, and then told them they were going to go across campus, and some of them were given differing amounts of time to prepare, and they were all going to go speak on the parable. And there was a setup. There was a man in an alley who looked like he'd been assaulted, and they had to pass by this man on the way to their assignment. And some small percentage that I wish I could conjure up out of the top of my head, but it's in the book, actually stopped and helped the man. And what a sad statement about all of us. There are so many things that can block fear of what if this is a trap, our own busyness, our own selfishness, all those things. Well, then, of course, here comes this other person, this Good Samaritan, who does stop. And it's such an example of the difference between self-leadership and when our parts take over and we're living blended parts. Because same thing, he could have been afraid, but stopped, cared for the person, took him to the inn, made sure he was comfortable and cared for and paid things. I mean, everything you can imagine wanting to do when you're self-led, and just using that as an example of the value of doing our internal work.
I love that. And I love too that you're really pointing out that this message from the capital C church is often, be selfless. And what selfless means is ignoring all of your emotional needs or psychological needs or emotional relationship needs or, whatever that is. And then, end up being in abusive situations or helping out of duty or lack, and then being resentful, and then you have sort of miserable people. You have sort of really miserable, hurt, wounded people. And then the world, capital W, is like, why would we want anything to do with the church? Because those people are miserable and abuse each other. So no, thank you.
Yeah, no kidding. No, thank you. And plenty of people are saying no, thank you. And that's a bit of a tangent, but I think in a very healthy way that there's been some waking up, and church going forward is going to look different because people have been waking up and realizing that those messages are incongruent with what Jesus preached. So
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that instead of leaving the church, which is also a thing that people are doing, which we know, but that's saying we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We could do this faith thing differently. We could do this Jesus thing differently. And actually more aligned with what Jesus taught and what we find in the Bible.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing. The more that we do our internal work, I believe the more we're able to actually see Jesus as Jesus really was, and which is much more challenging than our Wonder Bread version of Jesus.
That's good. Yeah. And I think I know what you mean by Wonder Bread.
Yeah. So, it did white for one thing, squishy, not challenging us. It's really easy to forget about how challenging nonviolence is, how challenging it is to take seriously the message of being unconditionally loving. I mean, that's not easy. And it's about our healing, because in some regards, if we're created in the image of God, who is love, Scripture says, then love should be our most natural response. But I always joke I can go about 5 minutes before something is constraining that in me. And the more we release the constraints to love, the more we can actually show up in the ways that I believe Jesus was inviting us to show up.
That's beautiful. What else feels important to share?
I did really write this with people in mind who have started to struggle with maybe they're still in the church, maybe they're not. they've been hurt by the misuse of scripture, and maybe they're done, and that's okay, and I get it, and they need to do what they need to do. I'm not on some mission to say, no, you need to get back into the Bible. But at the same time, these sacred stories have stood the test of time. Stories that stand the test of time are stories that touch us in our own humanity and both reveal something about ourselves, meet us where we are. And so to lose this treasure trove of sacred stories felt like doesn't sit well with me either. And so my hope was to help people who've been burned maybe see scripture in a new way. And I tackle some thorny theological issues in the book, and maybe bring some new voices to some of those challenges that people haven't had an opportunity to hear from. So.
Ooh, can you name one, or is there one that comes to
someone
mind?
like Will Gaffney, a womanist theologian. So if people aren't familiar with that term, so these are Black women who, who is doing theology, called a womanist theologian, and Will Gaffney's the leading one that I know of anyway. I'm sure there are many others. And just bringing that perspective to these stories is profound. And so just voices. And again, I mentioned Pete Enns. He's a biblical scholar who also exposes people to wonderful other biblical scholars, bringing Jewish voices to speak to the Hebrew Bible. What a concept. And yeah, just to try to bring in some resources that have been helpful for me as I've been on my own journey of wrestling. My first book was prompted by seeing people in spiritual communities who were at best not helpful, and in some cases harming people who turned to them for support. And I thought, wait a minute, aren't we supposed to be loving? What's going on here? And IFS gives us such a potent lens through which to understand all of that.
I love that. What's been happening for you since the release of your book? So I'm just curious what parts of you've been noticing.
Oh, good question. Well, there's a part or parts of me that always feel like I should be doing more to promote it. No matter how, as a self-published author or independently published, I do hire a professional editor and all of that, but I don't have the big platform and the publishing deal and all of that. So, but although even when you do, it still falls on you to promote the book. So there's always that. I mentioned I'm in a doctoral program. And so once I launched the book the end of January, and have been very consumed by the requirements of this program and my other work since then. So feeling a little bit like, but
what's your Enneagram type?
You want to guess?
I think you're a one.
We talked before.
Did we talk about this? You're one.
I'm a one. Yeah. So you feel that reformer energy in the work that I'm doing. It very much, very much working with those parts of me, so that when I show up with that reformer energy, it's also again linked arms with self energy, so that it's in a helpful way. I can get pretty fired up about spiritual abuse.
Love that linked arms though, because we don't want to, thinking about the Enneagram, you don't want to lose the gifts of a one, right? There's gifts and blessings in a one. And so I love that kind of linked up, right? I can link up with my reformer that's leading my oneness, and I in self can link up with that. And that is a different energy. I love that.
Yeah.
That's great. So great.
Yeah.
So Molly, where can people find you? Where can they get your book? Give us all the details.
Yeah, well, the easiest thing to do is my website, which is mollylacroix.com. And so they've access to everything about me and the books, and can find me on social media. On social media, I'm Molly LaCroix, LMFT, my credentials on Instagram and Facebook. I do a monthly email so people can subscribe to that. And I just keep it to once a month, different topics that provide some practices for understanding ourselves in this way. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to shift to Substack soon. So I'm kind of toying with maybe the audience doesn't have to hold me to it, but I'm thinking about Exiled and Embraced as my Substack.
Oh, I love that.
Oh, thank you.
I love that. What's the draw to Substack? Because I think that, people are talking. Yeah.
It's just such an easy platform for people to share. There's more engagement, and I don't want people to have to go through hoops to, you have to do all these things to get people to sign up for your emails. And all of that is what the publishers say you should do. Right. Well, I'm over it.
I love it.
So I'm not going to play that game. I'm too old.
Yeah, right. Because you have to have so many people on your email list to present at blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it's ridiculous. Yeah.
I'm over it.
I love it. I have a part that's the same. I'm not playing that game. I love it, Molly.
To get my work in the world.
I know. Yeah, you have to jump through all this stuff. It's have parts that are like, yep, I'll do it. And then I have other parts that are like, I've quit. I'm out. I'm not doing that.
Yes. Yeah, I hear you.
So, Molly, let's do the last question. If you weren't doing what you're doing and you have to do something different, Molly, what would you do instead?
Oh, well, my very favorite thing is to be out in nature. And although the doctoral program really messed up my ski season this year, but semester's over in a couple of weeks and there's probably still some good spring skiing to be had. So I will be skiing. And we just recently adopted a 2-year-old Saint Bernard, and she is my spirit animal. I adore her so much. And I love to play with her and go hike with her. And we're integrating her into our household. And
what's her name?
Sophie.
Sophie. Oh, that's so exciting. That's so exciting.
Yeah. And of course, playing with my grandchildren. I don't know why that didn't come first, but I have 4 littles and I'm mini to my littles. And that is the absolute best thing.
I love that. I love that. Anything else you want to share? Anything else you feel like is important to let the listeners know?
I just would love to connect with them if they want to find me through my website and shoot me a note. I'm always eager to hear from people.
I love that. I love that. And make sure you get on her email list.
For now. And then it'll be Substack. It'll be so much easier.
I love that. I love that. Well, Molly, this is great. It's been really interesting and encouraging. And
thank you.
Yeah. So thank you so much. Thanks for hanging out with us today. If you like this episode, please subscribe, rate, like, all the things. My book is available at your favorite independent bookstore or all the places books are available. You can also visit my website, tammysollenberger.com, where you can download a free meditation on getting to know your should parts. You know, there's parts of you who remind you of what you should be doing. They sound a bit critical at times. Yes, we all have them. You can follow me at IFS Tammy on Instagram and Twitter and the One Inside Facebook page. I'm so grateful for Jack Reardon, who created the new music. Jack is a graduate of Derek Scott's IFS Stepping Stone program. Thanks, Jack, for getting me. And to you, thanks for listening.